The child who was born to die lived instead to become the most dangerous deception ever to draw breath, transforming from phantom son to phantom soldier to phantom pirate, leaving behind a trail of bewildered men who never suspected that death might come at them wearing petticoats beneath a warrior-esque disguise. In the waning years of the 17th century, when England was still drunk on the possibilities of empire and the New World beckoned with promises of gold and glory, a woman named Mary Read gave birth to a daughter in circumstances so desperate that survival itself required the abandonment of truth. The exact location of this birth remains as shrouded in mystery as everything else about Mary Read's extraordinary life. Some claim it was Plymouth, others insist upon London, but the date was approximately 1685, and the situation was one that would have destroyed a less resourceful woman entirely. Mary Read's mother was a widow whose husband, a sea captain, had perished in service to England's growing maritime ambitions, leaving her with a young son and the kind of modest pension that colonial wives received when their husbands died in service to king and commerce. It was barely enough to survive upon, but it represented the difference between genteel poverty and absolute destitution. When her legitimate son died, whether from disease, accident, or the thousand other perils that claimed children in that brutal age, the pension died with him, leaving the widow Mary Read to face a future that promised nothing but starvation and social obliteration. But desperation, as Mary Read would discover throughout her extraordinary life, often breeds the kind of innovation that more comfortable circumstances could never inspire. The widow had given birth to an illegitimate daughter after her husband's death, and now faced a choice between watching that daughter starve or finding some way to preserve the fiction that her son still lived. It was not a choice at all. Really, it was simply the recognition that survival sometimes required the complete abandonment of conventional truth in favor of necessary deception. So, the infant girl became a boy in the eyes of the world, dressed in masculine clothes and raised to answer to a masculine name. The deception was not merely cosmetic but fundamental, requiring the widow to maintain a performance that could never be allowed to slip, never be permitted to reveal the desperate circumstances that had necessitated it. Young Mary grew up understanding, though perhaps not consciously articulating, that her very existence depended upon the successful maintenance of an elaborate fiction. The psychological impact of such an upbringing can hardly be imagined. Here was a child who learned from her earliest moments that identity was fluid, that social expectations could be manipulated through careful performance, and that survival often required the complete suppression of one's authentic self in favor of whatever role circumstances demanded. She absorbed these lessons with the unconscious thoroughness that only children possess, integrating them so completely into her fundamental understanding of the world that deception became as natural as breathing. The charade succeeded brilliantly for years. The paternal grandmother, who had genuinely loved her grandson, accepted the continued presence of the child she believed to be her beloved boy, and continued providing the financial support that kept the small household from complete destitution. Neighbors who might have questioned the arrangement had no reason to suspect that the lively boy they occasionally encountered was anything other than what he appeared to be. But such deceptions, no matter how skillfully maintained, inevitably contained the seeds of their own destruction. As Mary grew from infant to child to adolescent, the physical changes that marked her transition toward womanhood threatened to expose the fiction that had sustained her family's survival. The curves that began to appear beneath her carefully chosen clothing, the subtle shifts in voice and movement that marked feminine maturation, all of these changes had to be concealed or explained away, requiring ever more elaborate strategies of concealment. Moreover, the grandmother was aging, and with her advancing years came the inevitable questions about her grandson's future. When would he marry? What trade would he pursue? How would he support himself once she was no longer able to provide for him? These were reasonable questions that any loving grandmother might ask, but they pointed toward a future that Mary Read, despite her masculine appearance and upbringing, could never actually inhabit. The solution, when it finally came, demonstrated the kind of bold thinking that would characterize Mary's entire approach to life's challenges. Rather than allowing the deception to collapse and facing the consequences of exposure, she would instead expand the fiction, taking it beyond the narrow confines of her family circle and into the wider world. If she had successfully convinced her grandmother that she was a boy, why not convince everyone else as well? The decision to leave home and seek employment as a young man was audacious beyond words. Here was a teenager with no legitimate masculine experience, no masculine connections, and no masculine skills, proposing to compete with genuine males for employment in occupations that were not merely traditionally masculine, but legally restricted to males. It was a gamble that could have ended in disaster, exposure, and the kind of public humiliation that would have destroyed any possibility of future reinvention. But Mary Read possessed something that most people, regardless of gender, never develop: the absolute conviction that she could become whatever circumstances required her to become. The child who had spent her entire life successfully maintaining an elaborate deception had developed not just the technical skills necessary for such performance, but the psychological flexibility that allowed her to inhabit different identities with complete conviction. Her first employment as a footboy, essentially a male servant, provided the perfect training ground for her expanded deception. The position required her to dress appropriately, speak appropriately, and move through masculine social spaces with the kind of easy confidence that would never invite suspicion. She had to learn not just to look like a man, but to think like a man, to absorb the subtle patterns of masculine behavior so completely that her performance became indistinguishable from authentic masculinity. The work itself was menial and poorly paid, offering little beyond basic survival and the opportunity to perfect her disguise. But Mary was not the sort of person to remain satisfied with mere survival when greater opportunities beckoned. She had tasted the intoxicating freedom that came with masculine identity, the ability to move freely through the world, to make her own decisions, to pursue whatever opportunities her abilities might earn her hand. She wanted more. The decision to leave domestic service and seek her fortune at sea represented another dramatic escalation of her ongoing deception. Maritime employment was not merely restricted to males, but demanded the kind of physical strength and technical knowledge that years of domestic service had hardly prepared her for. She would be living in close quarters with experienced seamen who would have immediately detected any feminine characteristics or inadequacies in seamanship. Yet she succeeded brilliantly, demonstrating not just the courage necessary to attempt such a bold deception, but the intelligence and adaptability necessary to make it work. She learned the complex skills of sailing, navigation, and shipboard life with the kind of focused intensity that comes from understanding that failure would mean not merely professional disappointment, but complete exposure and social destruction. Her service aboard merchant vessels during the 1690s coincided with England's escalating conflicts with France, conflicts that would eventually explode into the War of the Spanish Succession and transform the political landscape of Europe. These were dangerous times for English merchants, whose ships faced constant threats from French privateers and naval vessels. Mary found herself participating in the kind of maritime warfare that was rapidly becoming the norm for English commercial shipping. The experience was transformative in ways that went far beyond mere professional development. Here was a young woman who had spent her entire life concealing her true nature, suddenly finding herself in situations that demanded the most extreme expressions of masculine courage and aggression. She had to learn not just to fight, but to fight with the kind of brutal effectiveness that would convince experienced sailors that she belonged among them. The psychological challenge was enormous. Combat at sea in the late 17th century was intimate, violent, and absolutely unforgiving. There was no room for hesitation, no opportunity for half measures, no possibility of maintaining feminine sensibilities while engaging in the kind of brutal, hand-to-hand fighting that determined victory or defeat. Mary had to embrace violence completely, to internalize masculine patterns of aggression so thoroughly that they became indistinguishable from her authentic responses to threatening situations. But perhaps more significantly, she discovered that she possessed a natural talent for warfare that transcended gender entirely. Her quick thinking, steady nerves, and fierce determination made her not just an adequate sailor but an exceptional one. The men who fought alongside her began to recognize her as someone they could depend upon in the most desperate circumstances. Someone whose courage and competence made her invaluable to their collective survival. This recognition brought both satisfaction and frustration. Mary was succeeding brilliantly in her chosen profession, earning the respect and admiration of colleagues who had no idea that they were praising the achievements of a woman. But the very success of her deception meant that she could never fully enjoy the recognition she was earning, could never allow herself to take complete pride in accomplishments that had to remain forever attributed to a fictional masculine identity. The frustration eventually drove her to seek new challenges that might provide greater scope for her abilities. When the War of the Spanish Succession erupted across Europe in 1701, Mary made the decision that would define the next phase of her extraordinary career. She would abandon maritime employment and join the English army fighting in Flanders, where the greatest military minds of the age were locked in combat that would determine the future balance of European power. The decision to enlist in the army represented yet another dramatic escalation of her ongoing deception. Military service demanded not just physical courage, but the kind of sustained masculine performance that left no room for error or relaxation. She would be living in barracks with other soldiers, sharing the most intimate aspects of daily life with men who would immediately detect any feminine characteristics. The slightest slip, the smallest inconsistency, would expose her to consequences that could range from imprisonment to execution. Yet she succeeded again, demonstrating that her talent for deception had evolved far beyond mere disguise to become something approaching genius. She learned to march, to drill, to handle the complex weapons of early 18th century warfare with the same focused intensity that had made her successful at sea. More importantly, she learned to inhabit masculine military culture so completely that her fellow soldiers accepted her not just as a competent colleague, but as a natural leader whose judgment could be trusted in the most desperate circumstances. The battlefields of Flanders during the War of the Spanish Succession were among the most brutal and challenging military environments in European history. Here, the flower of English, French, Dutch, and Austrian manhood was being systematically destroyed in conflicts that combined the tactical innovations of modern warfare with the primitive medical knowledge that made even minor wounds potentially fatal. Mary found herself participating in some of the most significant military actions of her generation. Battles that would be remembered for centuries as defining moments in European political development. Her service record, insofar as it can be reconstructed from fragmentary historical accounts, suggests that she not only survived these brutal encounters, but distinguished herself through exceptional courage and tactical brilliance. She was recognized by her superiors as the kind of soldier who could be depended upon to maintain discipline under fire, to execute complex orders under the most challenging circumstances, and to provide the kind of steady leadership that kept units cohesive when lesser soldiers might have broken and fled. But it was during this period of military service that Mary encountered the situation that would force her to confront the fundamental contradictions of her chosen life. She fell in love with a fellow soldier, a man whose courage and character had earned her genuine admiration and affection. For the first time since childhood, she found herself wanting to share her authentic identity with another person, to abandon the deception that had sustained her survival in favor of the kind of honest intimacy that genuine love seemed to require. The decision to reveal her true identity to her lover was perhaps the most courageous act of her entire extraordinary career. Here was a woman who had successfully maintained an elaborate deception for decades, risking everything she had achieved on the hope that one man's love might prove stronger than his shock at discovering that his trusted comrade was actually a woman. The revelation could have destroyed not just their relationship, but her entire, carefully constructed, masculine identity, exposing her to military discipline that would certainly have included imprisonment and possibly death. But love, as Mary discovered, could indeed prove stronger than social convention. Her fellow soldier, rather than reacting with horror or betrayal, embraced both her authentic identity and the extraordinary courage that her deception had required. They were married in a ceremony that must have been among the most unusual in military history. A woman who had spent years successfully posing as a man finally claiming the right to exist as herself. Their brief period of married happiness provided Mary with her first taste of authentic domestic life since childhood. They left military service together and attempted to establish themselves as innkeepers, running a tavern that catered to soldiers and travelers moving through the war-torn European countryside. For a brief moment, it seemed that Mary had found a way to balance her extraordinary abilities with the conventional life that her authentic gender made necessary. But happiness built upon such extraordinary foundations proved as fragile as it was precious. Her husband died suddenly, whether from disease, accident, or the lingering effects of his military service, leaving Mary once again alone and faced with the stark choice between accepting conventional feminine limitations or returning to the masculine identity that had provided her with freedom and opportunity. The choice was inevitable. The woman who had tasted absolute freedom could not accept the constraints that society imposed upon widows, no matter how respectable their circumstances. She had proven herself capable of succeeding in the most demanding masculine professions, had earned recognition and respect through her own abilities rather than through marriage or inheritance, and had experienced the intoxicating sense of controlling her own destiny that was normally reserved exclusively for men. So she assumed masculine dress once again and rejoined the army, this time serving in different units where her previous identity was unknown. The transition back to masculine life must have been psychologically wrenching. She was not merely abandoning her brief experience of authentic femininity, but returning to a deception that now carried the additional burden of concealing her grief and her memories of genuine love. Her second military career was shorter than her first, but equally distinguished. She served with competence and courage until the Peace of Utrecht in 1713 ended the War of the Spanish Succession and left thousands of experienced soldiers without employment. Like so many of her generation, Mary found herself facing a peacetime world that had little use for the skills that war had taught her, and no interest in providing for the veterans who had secured victory at such terrible cost. The decision to seek her fortune overseas was natural for someone with her maritime experience and masculine identity. The Caribbean was calling to unemployed soldiers and sailors throughout Europe, promising opportunities for those bold enough to seize them and strong enough to survive in an environment where law was often measured in cannon shot and justice came at the point of a sword. But the voyage that was intended to carry her to legitimate employment in the Sugar Islands instead became the beginning of her most famous career. The merchant vessel on which she had taken passage was attacked and captured by pirates, led by Calico Jack Rackham, one of the most successful and charismatic pirates operating in Caribbean waters. The capture presented Mary with a choice that would define the final phase of her extraordinary life. She could reveal her true identity and hope for protection as a female passenger, accepting whatever treatment pirates might provide to women who fell into their hands. Or she could maintain her masculine disguise and face whatever consequences might follow from being treated as just another member of the captured crew. Her decision to maintain her deception and join Rackham's crew demonstrated that the years of military service had not diminished her appetite for adventure and danger. Here was an opportunity to apply her hard-won skills in an environment where competence mattered more than birth, where courage could earn advancement more rapidly than in any legitimate profession, and where the kind of freedom she had always sought could be pursued without apology or concealment. The transformation from soldier to pirate proved remarkably smooth. Mary's military experience had provided her with exactly the skills that successful piracy required: tactical thinking, weapons expertise, leadership ability, and the kind of steady courage under fire that made the difference between successful raids and disastrous failures. She quickly established herself as one of Rackham's most valuable crew members, earning respect through demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege. But it was her encounter with Bonny that would create one of the most extraordinary relationships in the annals of piracy. Anne was Rackham's lover, and one of the few women ever to pursue piracy as an active profession rather than simply as the companion of a pirate captain. The meeting between these two remarkable women, one disguised as a man, the other openly female, but demanding to be treated as an equal, created a partnership that enhanced both their individual capabilities and their collective impact on Caribbean piracy. The relationship between Mary and Anne was complex and has been the subject of speculation and legend for centuries. Some accounts suggest romantic attraction between them, others emphasize their friendship and mutual respect. What seems certain is that they recognized in each other the same fierce independence and refusal to accept conventional limitations that had driven both of them to such extraordinary careers. Their partnership transformed Rackham's crew into something unprecedented in the annals of Caribbean piracy. Here was a vessel where two women served not as passengers or ornaments, but as full participants in every aspect of piratical enterprise. Mary's military experience, combined with Anne's natural courage and intelligence, to create a formidable fighting force that enhanced the crew's effectiveness while challenging every assumption about gender roles and capabilities. The psychological impact of their presence extended far beyond their actual contributions to the crew's success. The sight of women fighting alongside men with equal ferocity and skill had a devastating effect on the morale of their opponents. Merchant sailors who might have been willing to resist male pirates found their courage failing when faced with the unprecedented spectacle of armed women, who seemed to relish combat as much as their masculine colleagues. But perhaps more significantly, Mary and Anne's partnership demonstrated that women could succeed in the most demanding masculine professions without sacrificing their essential humanity or their capacity for genuine friendship. They supported each other through the dangers and challenges of piratical life, while maintaining their individual identities and pursuing their separate relationships with the men they loved. Mary's relationship with a fellow crew member, sailor who knew her only in her masculine disguise, presented her with the same challenges she had faced during her military career. Once again, she found herself wanting to share her authentic identity with someone she had come to love, risking everything she had achieved on the hope that genuine affection might prove stronger than social convention. Her decision to reveal her true identity to her lover was made easier by her previous experience, and by the supportive presence of an Bonny, who understood better than anyone the challenges that such revelations presented. The sailor's acceptance of Mary's true identity demonstrated that love could indeed transcend the boundaries that society attempted to impose, creating space for authentic intimacy even within the unconventional world of Caribbean piracy. Their relationship flourished within the unique environment of Rackham's crew, where unconventional identities and relationships were not merely tolerated but actively valued. Here was a community that had consciously rejected the constraints of respectable society in favor of something more personally fulfilling, creating space for individuals whose authentic selves could never have found acceptance in more conventional environments. The success of their operations during 1720 established Mary Ann and Rackham as among the most formidable pirates operating in Caribbean waters. They captured numerous vessels, accumulated substantial treasure, and developed a reputation for both effectiveness and relative restraint in their treatment of prisoners. Their approach to piracy emphasized profit over gratuitous violence, demonstrating that successful criminal enterprises could be conducted with a degree of professionalism that challenged stereotypes about piratical brutality. But their very success made them targets for increasingly determined efforts at suppression. Colonial authorities who might have tolerated ordinary piracy could not ignore the spectacular challenge to social order represented by successful female pirates. The sight of women succeeding in traditionally masculine pursuits threatened fundamental assumptions about gender roles and capabilities, making their suppression a priority that transcended mere law enforcement. The end came in October 1720, when Captain Jonathan Barnett, commanding a sloop commissioned by the governor of Jamaica, encountered their vessel near Negro Point. The battle that followed would become one of the most famous in pirate history, not because of its strategic significance, but because of what it revealed about courage, loyalty, and the price of unconventional choices. The engagement began badly for the pirates. Most of Rackham's crew were in various states of intoxication. celebrating a recent capture and completely unprepared for serious combat. As Barnett's well-trained sailors boarded their vessel, the male pirates offered only token resistance before retreating below decks, leaving Mary and Anne to face the attack virtually alone. What followed was a display of courage that would have impressed the most hardened military veterans. The two women fought with the desperate fury of those who understood that capture would mean certain death, holding off trained naval personnel for far longer than should have been possible. Mary's military experience combined with Anne's natural aggression to create a defense that came close to repelling the attack entirely. But even their extraordinary courage could not compensate for the complete failure of their male colleagues. Outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed, they were captured and bound for Spanish Town, where they would face the kind of legal proceedings that invariably ended with death sentences for convicted pirates. The trials that followed were among the most spectacular in Caribbean legal history. The prospect of seeing notorious pirates brought to justice always drew large crowds, but the inclusion of two female defendants made these proceedings unprecedented. Colonial society had never before witnessed the spectacle of women standing trial for piracy, and public interest was intense. Mary's trial revealed the full extent of her extraordinary deception. Here was a woman who had successfully maintained masculine identity for decades, serving with distinction in both military and piratical careers, while convincing countless colleagues that she was everything she appeared to be. The revelation of her true identity shocked even the experienced legal officials, who thought they had seen every possible variation of criminal behavior. The evidence of piracy was overwhelming. The defendants had been captured in arms, and colonial law provided no alternative to death sentences for convicted pirates. Mary and Anne were both found guilty and sentenced to death, joining Rackham and the other members of their crew who had already received similar judgments. But both women had one final card to play. Each claimed to be pregnant, and under British law, pregnant women could not be executed until after they had given birth. The pregnancy defense provided them with at least temporary reprieve from the gallows and the possibility that changing circumstances might eventually lead to commutation of their sentences. Mary's pregnancy was genuine, the result of her relationship with a fellow crew member who had accepted her authentic identity and loved her despite the dangers that such love presented. The child she carried represented both hope for continued life and the ultimate irony of her extraordinary career. A woman who had spent decades denying her feminine nature was now depending upon that same feminine nature for survival. But Mary Reed's story was destined to end in tragedy rather than redemption. She died in prison in 1721, probably from fever related to childbirth complications, before her sentence could be carried out or commuted. The woman who had survived countless battles, who had faced death in a dozen different forms, who had proven herself capable of extraordinary courage and endurance, was finally defeated by the biological realities she had spent her entire life attempting to transcend. Her death removed from the world one of the most remarkable individuals of any generation. Mary Reed had proven that individual will could triumph over social constraint, that personal courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and that even the most rigid boundaries could be crossed by those determined enough to attempt the crossing. But perhaps more significantly, she had demonstrated that women could succeed in the most demanding masculine professions without sacrificing their essential humanity or their capacity for love and friendship. Her relationships with her military husband, her pirate lover, and Bonny all showed that authentic intimacy was possible, even within the context of elaborate deception. That genuine affection could transcend the boundaries that society attempted to impose. The military skills she had developed through years of service in Flanders made her one of the most formidable fighters of her generation, male or female. Her tactical thinking, weapons expertise, and natural leadership ability would have made her valuable in any army of her era. The fact that she achieved such competence while maintaining an elaborate gender deception only makes her accomplishments more remarkable. Her brief career as a pirate, while it ended tragically, demonstrated that women could participate as equals in the most violent and demanding criminal enterprises. Her partnership with Bonny created something unprecedented in maritime history. A vessel where women served not just as passengers or companions, but as full participants in every aspect of piratical life. The psychological impact of her story extends far beyond her immediate historical context. Here was a woman who refused to accept the limitations that society attempted to impose upon her, who carved out space for herself in professions that were supposedly beyond feminine capacity, and who proved that gender was often less important than courage, intelligence, and determination. Her lifetime of successful deception revealed the extent to which gender roles were social constructions rather than natural law. If a woman could successfully convince experienced soldiers and sailors that she was a man, then the differences between masculine and feminine capabilities were perhaps less absolute than society insisted they were. The tragedy of her story lies not in her criminal career or violent death, but in the fact that she was forced to deny her authentic identity in order to achieve her potential. A society that provided space for women to pursue military and maritime careers would never have required the elaborate deception that defined Mary's entire adult life. Yet within the constraints of her historical moment, she achieved something extraordinary. She lived entirely according to her own choices and values, refusing to accept the limitations that convention attempted to impose. She proved that individual will could triumph over social constraint, that personal courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Her influence on subsequent generations has been profound, though often unrecognized. Every woman who has refused to accept traditional limitations, who has pursued careers once reserved for men, who has demanded to be treated as an equal rather than as a dependent, owes something to the precedent that Mary Read established centuries ago. The stories that continue to be told about her emphasize different aspects of her remarkable career, but all recognize something fundamental about her character. She was a person who refused to accept defeat, who found ways to turn even the most desperate circumstances to her advantage, and who maintained her essential humanity even within the most dehumanizing environments. Her friendship with Bonny represented something unprecedented in the masculine world of Caribbean piracy, a genuine partnership between equals who supported each other as unconventional choices while pursuing their separate destinies. Their relationship demonstrated that women could form the kind of bonds that enhanced, rather than compromised, their individual effectiveness. The mystery surrounding her early life and the fragmentary nature of historical records have made Mary Read as much legend as historical figure. But the legends that have grown up around her story speak to something timeless about the human condition. The eternal struggle between individual freedom and social constraint. The dream of living according to one's own values rather than society's expectations. Her story continues to resonate because it addresses needs and desires that transcend any particular historical period. In every generation, there are individuals who find themselves constrained by the expectations and limitations of their society, who dream of breaking free from conventional paths to pursue something more exciting and personally fulfilling. The technical aspects of Mary's deception were as remarkable as its duration and scope. To successfully maintain masculine identity for decades required not just the right clothing and mannerisms, but a complete understanding of masculine psychology and social patterns. She had to learn to walk, talk, fight, and think like a man so completely that even intimate companions never suspected her true nature. Consider the physical challenges alone. Binding her breasts so tightly that no curve would show beneath her clothing. Modulating her voice to maintain masculine pitch even under stress. Developing the kind of upper body strength that would allow her to perform heavy labor alongside experienced seamen and soldiers. These were not simple cosmetic changes but fundamental alterations to her physical presence that required constant vigilance and continuous reinforcement. The psychological challenges were even more demanding. Mary had to internalize masculine patterns of aggression, competition, and emotional expression so thoroughly that they became her natural responses to threatening situations. She could not afford moments of feminine vulnerability or hesitation. could not allow herself the luxury of tears or displays of fear that might have been acceptable in women, but would have marked her as weak or unreliable among the men she served alongside. The military culture of her era was particularly unforgiving in this regard. Soldiers who showed fear or uncertainty in battle could expect not just professional consequences, but social ostracism from their comrades. Mary had to prove herself capable of the kind of sustained courage under fire that would convince hardened veterans that she belonged among them, that her presence enhanced, rather than compromised, their collective effectiveness. Her success in this environment speaks to qualities that transcend gender entirely: intelligence, adaptability, and the kind of fierce determination that refuses to accept defeat, regardless of the odds. The battles she fought in Flanders were among the most brutal in European military history. Conflicts that combined primitive medical knowledge with increasingly sophisticated weapons, technology to create casualty rates that would have broken lesser spirits. Yet Mary not only survived these encounters, but distinguished herself through exceptional performance that earned recognition from superior officers who had no idea they were praising the achievements of a woman. Her tactical thinking, weapons expertise, and natural leadership ability made her valuable in any military context, while her lifetime of maintaining elaborate deception had developed exactly the kind of mental flexibility that successful warfare required. The transition from legitimate military service to piracy represented not just a change of profession, but a fundamental shift in moral framework. As a soldier, Mary had been fighting for recognized political causes under the protection of military law and tradition. As a pirate, she was operating outside all legal frameworks, dependent entirely upon her own resources and the loyalty of colleagues who shared her criminal circumstances. This transition required yet another psychological adjustment that few people would have been capable of managing successfully. Mary had to abandon the moral certainties that had sustained her through years of legitimate warfare and embrace the kind of pragmatic amorality that successful piracy demanded. She had to learn to evaluate potential targets not as fellow human beings deserving of consideration, but as sources of profit to be exploited with maximum efficiency. Yet she managed this transition without losing her essential humanity or her capacity for genuine relationships. Her friendship with Bonny demonstrated that even within the morally ambiguous world of Caribbean piracy, authentic bonds could be formed between individuals who recognized and valued each other's unconventional qualities. The relationship between Mary and Anne was unprecedented, not just because it involved two female pirates, but because it represented a partnership between equals who enhanced each other's capabilities, rather than competing for dominance. In the masculine world of piracy, where leadership was typically established through displays of superior force or cunning, their collaboration created something entirely new, a model of shared authority based on mutual respect and complementary skills. Anne's fierce independence and natural aggression complemented Mary's military experience and tactical sophistication, creating a combination that made both women more effective than either could have been alone. Their partnership challenged fundamental assumptions about feminine nature, while demonstrating that women could form the kind of professional relationships that enhanced rather than undermined their individual achievements. The psychological impact of their presence on Rackham's crew extended far beyond their contributions to combat effectiveness. Here was visible proof that the pirate community's rejection of conventional social hierarchies was more than mere rhetoric, that individuals who had abandoned respectable society could indeed create alternative communities based on merit rather than birth or gender. Their success as pirates was measured not just in treasure accumulated, but in respect earned from colleagues, who judged them solely on their contributions to collective survival and prosperity. In a world where reputation was literally a matter of life and death, both women established themselves as formidable fighters whose courage and competence made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies. The operations they participated in during 1720 demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Caribbean commerce and navigation. Successful piracy required detailed knowledge of shipping schedules, trade routes, and seasonal patterns that governed the movement of wealth throughout the region. Mary's military experience provided her with exactly the kind of strategic thinking that such operations demanded, while Anne's intuitive understanding of human psychology made her invaluable in negotiations with captured crews and officials. Their approach to piracy emphasized professionalism over gratuitous violence, reflecting both practical considerations and genuine moral principles. Unnecessary brutality alienated potential sources of information and made future operations more difficult, while restrained treatment of prisoners often led to cooperation that could prove more valuable than any treasure chest. This professional approach distinguished them from pirates who were motivated primarily by sadistic impulses or desperate circumstances. Mary and Anne were career criminals who had made calculated decisions about how they wanted to live their lives, choosing piracy not because they lacked alternatives, but because it offered opportunities for freedom and achievement that were unavailable in more conventional pursuits. Their partnership also challenged contemporary assumptions about feminine relationships and capabilities. Colonial society insisted that women were naturally competitive with each other, incapable of the kind of genuine friendship that existed between men, and unsuited for the collaborative enterprises that success in masculine professions required. Mary and Anne proved these assumptions false through their sustained collaboration and mutual support. They demonstrated that women could form professional partnerships based on shared goals and complementary abilities, that feminine friendship could enhance rather than compromise individual effectiveness, and that women working together could achieve more than either could accomplish alone. The capture that ended their piratical careers revealed the full extent of their courage and commitment to each other. When Barnett's forces boarded their vessel and the male crew members fled below decks, Mary and Anne continued fighting with the kind of desperate ferocity that impressed even their captors. They understood that surrender would mean certain death, but they also understood that their resistance might provide time for their colleagues to mount effective counterattack. Their final battle demonstrated everything that had made them formidable throughout their careers: tactical intelligence, physical courage, and absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when facing overwhelming odds. They fought not just for their own survival, but for the principles they had chosen to represent, refusing to provide their enemies with the satisfaction of easy victory. The legal proceedings that followed their capture were complicated by the unprecedented nature of their case. Colonial courts had extensive experience with male pirates, but female defendants presented challenges that exposed the limitations of existing legal frameworks. How should women who had chosen to live as men be classified? What precedents applied to cases involving defendants whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and capabilities? The judges who presided over their trials struggled with questions that had no clear answers in existing legal tradition. Should Mary be tried as a woman who had disguised herself as a man, or as a man who happened to be biologically female? Should her military service be considered as mitigating evidence of patriotic intent, or as aggravating evidence of systematic deception? These were not merely technical legal questions, but fundamental challenges to the conceptual frameworks that colonial society used to understand identity and responsibility. The pregnancy defense that saved both women from immediate execution represented a final irony in careers built upon challenging conventional expectations. Here were two individuals who had spent their adult lives rejecting traditional feminine roles, now depending upon the most fundamentally feminine condition for their survival. Mary's pregnancy was a result of her relationship with a fellow crew member who had accepted her authentic identity and loved her despite the dangers such love represented. The child she carried embodied both hope for continued life and the ultimate contradiction of her extraordinary career. A woman who had denied her feminine nature for decades was now dependent upon that same nature for survival. But even pregnancy could not ultimately save Mary from the consequences of her choices. The fever that killed her in Spanish Town prison was probably related to childbirth complications, making her death a bitter reminder of the biological realities she had spent her lifetime attempting to transcend. Her final weeks in prison must have been among the most psychologically challenging of her extraordinary life. For the first time since childhood, she was forced to exist as an acknowledged woman, surrounded by authorities and fellow prisoners who knew her true identity and judged her according to feminine rather than masculine standards. The guards who supervised her imprisonment struggled to reconcile the notorious pirate they had captured with the pregnant woman they were now required to protect. Their confusion reflected the broader social discomfort with individuals who refused to conform to established categories, who insisted upon creating their own definitions of identity and possibility. Mary's death removed from the world not just an individual of exceptional courage and ability, but a living example of human potential that transcended conventional limitations. She had proven that identity was more flexible than society insisted, that individual will could triumph over social constraints, and that women were capable of achieving excellence in any field they chose to enter. The impact of her story extended far beyond her immediate historical context. Every woman who has ever refused to accept traditional limitations, who has ever pursued careers once reserved for men, who has ever demanded to be treated as an equal rather than as a dependent, owes something to the precedent that Mary Read established. Her military service demonstrated that women could excel in the most demanding masculine professions when given the opportunity to do so. Her success as a pirate proved that female courage and intelligence were not inferior to masculine equivalents. Her friendship with Bonny showed that women could form the kind of professional partnerships that enhanced rather than compromised their individual effectiveness. The deception that defined her entire adult life revealed the extent to which gender roles were social constructions rather than natural law. If a woman could successfully convince experienced soldiers and sailors that she was a man, then the differences between masculine and feminine capabilities were perhaps less absolute than society insisted they were. Mary Read's greatest achievement was demonstrating that dreams of absolute freedom were not merely fantasies, but achievable realities for those bold enough to pursue them and strong enough to pay their price. She proved that even the most rigid social boundaries could be crossed by individuals with sufficient determination, that personal courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The Phantom Warrior, who had spent her entire life maintaining elaborate deceptions, finally found peace in death. But the example she established continues to inspire those who refuse to accept that their dreams are impossible simply because society insists they should be. Her legacy lives on in every person who has ever refused to accept limitations, who has ever chosen freedom over security, who has ever dared to be exactly what they chose to be rather than what others expected them to become. In the end, Mary Read's story is not just about piracy or gender deception, but about the fundamental human struggle for authentic self-expression in a world that demands conformity. She represents the eternal conflict between individual potential and social constraints, between personal dreams and collective expectations. Her life demonstrates that extraordinary achievement is possible for those willing to pay extraordinary prices, that freedom can be seized by those strong enough to defend it, and that human potential is limited more by social convention than by natural capacity. The waves that carried Mary Read to her final adventure have long since broken on distant shores. But the spirit that drove her to reject every limitation society attempted to impose continues to inspire those who understand that the only real prison is the one we build for ourselves through accepting that our dreams are impossible. She proved they are not impossible, they are simply expensive, and the price must be paid in courage, determination, and the willingness to stand alone against a world that insists we should be something other than what we choose to become.